I don't usually read. This is going to be very awkward. Anyway, there's been a hugely influential wave upon wave of women's photographic practices that have shifted the focus towards an intimate engagement with the personal. This autobiographical, affective approach to the photographic has been influenced by women's work over the years. My question I want to address really is, what does it mean to collaborate and work on both sides of the camera? To explore the interactive exchange that lies too often unrecognized behind photography as a medium. To make work through a process in dialogue that evolves through the openness to experimentation that these exchanges prompt. To build a deep sense of safety and trust. To truly listen to the other with empathy and work towards work together to give feelings and ideas a form. To experience being both the sitter-director and the photographer-therapist in the practice that I developed and continue to work with, in an attempt to create complete work, complex and problematic, that offers a multiplicity of positions, a multiplicity of possible identities, to make images that construct rather than reveal, and thereby refute any essentialist readings, and that intentionally challenge dominant cultural assumptions. Okay. Very early example that you can currently see actually at Welcome. Please go along. And it shows the process. It shows that this isn't a making of singular images, but rather an exploration of a story, a personal narrative that moves across and through experiences, that talks about, in this case, this is Jo working, her experience of being a latchkey child during the war, feeling overlooked and forgotten, moving through to embodying the feeling of her father after his wife had died, in mourning, and indeed not long before his own death. So stepping into a feeling of despair and pain. And then the act of transformation, the idea of not leaving the person you're working with in distress, but moving through to a, dare I use the word empowering? I don't know, that word's been kind of ruined. But anyway, into something, yeah, really, into something affirming and enjoying selfhood. Yeah, do go along. Jo's work that's so well known, the cross on the breast, the image that she couldn't make at the time, the image that she made in the safety of a collaborative working practice, talking about what it felt like to be marked up for amputation. And also, importantly, at the time, this was somebody making work about her experience rather than it being a photographer documenting another. This was very much about saying, this is what it feels like, and this is what I want to contest, and this is what I want you to think about, even identify with. Come on. But because it's important to explore not merely one's own history, but the history of the family that one comes from, this was Jo's attempt to step into her mother's experience, which she called double bind, double crossed, double shift. Her mother was factory worker, removing the evidence of the work and then taking care of the family, an all too familiar position for working class women, particularly having to hide how hard they work in order to work. Yes, I always loved this photo of my mum, taken before I was born in the 1930s. And very early phototherapy, I restaged it. Same jacket made by my father. Attempt at the same smile. But there's more to it, of course. What my mother would say was, life is hard, work is pain. I gave up my life for you. These were not easy things to hear. But, being who she was honest. And so I talked about a notion of elegant responsibility because she's trying to look the part. She's trying to look her best. In my family, you were told if you look right, you could go anywhere. That's my tailor father speaking. You sort of can, but how do you keep up the pretense is almost the question that I was asking by entering into her role. Because when I'm talking about this, of course, it's a reenactment. I'm trying to think about what it was like to be her. From my position, obviously, my information is only seeing her, being the child that she spoke to, but trying to step into a feeling of what it must have been like for her, as a woman who was used to working but had to return to the home in the 50s to bring up me when she'd already had a family. Yes, Mum's very present in this presentation because after she died, I went back to that reenactment in a very different way. I call this acts of reparation, and I made it in collaboration with Kay Goodrich. And what I was trying to do in this image, or this series, in fact, it's a video, you can see some of it online, was to forgive. My mother had multi-infarct dementia in her last years, and I was her carer, but primary carer. And it's tough. It's tough being around somebody whose ability to be in the world is disintegrating in front of you, who you still have to take care of and love because she's your mum. And so after she died, this was my attempt to mother myself in a strange way. By stepping into my image of her, I could somehow reclaim that loving gaze. In other words, it's very important to learn to take care of yourself. And if your first carer is your mother, that's a route into that ability to see and be seen. Okay, the father-dad at work. Always in the family album, he's smoking. I did a body of work on that called I Pose a Paradox, a discourse on smoking. And I reenacted the idea of the dapper father, said to look like Ronald Colman, but you'd have to be really old to get that reference. Film star from the 1930s. But what I really remembered about my relationship with my father from when I was a teenager was his anger and his despair. So that's what I was looking at in the last image. But of course, what's interesting when one does this kind of projection into the other is that that isn't my angry father. That, in fact, is my own anger, my own despair. In other words, when you do a reenactment, in many ways you're exploring your own self, your own emotional range, for good or ill. I'm sorry, I'm keeping an eye on time. Okay. That's another act of reparation, again in my parents' house after my mum had died. I tried to make a much more forgiving image of my father in the room that he created. Yes, those fine panels actually, it turned out, were laminate. They weren't real wood. He'd sort of created a theatrical stage in that room that I always thought was Tudor-esque. The paintings are his, curtains were his. It was tough when he died. Everywhere I looked, everything I touched, he'd made. And of course, my father is the tailor, the repairer, the act of reparation. So this was, again, a much more forgiving gaze than the earlier work, which I think was harsher. Let you enjoy that. Yeah, okay. Good place to show that, I think. Discussions around diversity and the necessity to include the full range of identities still too often omit the consideration of ageism and what it means to inhabit an older woman's body. I worked with Kay Goodrich. I started looking at this when I turned 50, actually, which now seems like ancient history, but it often is when you turn 50 that the crisis of aging hits the women because of the notion that women's identity is so linked with their sexuality and reproduction. So we use theoretical and performative strategies to analyse and contest the social and cultural construction of the ageing woman's body, which suggests decline, loss of sexuality, and redundancy. The rhetoric of popular cultural representations, for example, cosmetic advertising, or dare I even say cosmetic surgery, reinforces disavowals. Consequently, ageing is positioned as a problem to be overcome, hidden, or denied. We challenge these dominant cultural representations by inventing and transforming cultural assumptions. Obviously, here we're playing with notions of mutton and lamb. I don't think I need to go. It's called trying it on. We did it at Topshop. We were in a very small changing room. We had like no space. And we made these images. And what's wonderful is that they talk to young women as well, because that anxiety of the changing room is something that many of us share. But believe me, as you get older and you have more, but yeah, there are so many more opportunities for desire and discontent. It's funny, but why are we laughing? Are we identifying? I certainly hope so in this audience. Yes, okay. Voicing and visualizing other ways of inhabiting our own aging bodies. Our approach was at times parodic, playful, confrontational, vulnerable, transgressive, carnivalesque, a lot of playing with Batkin's notions of the grotesque, monstrous female, tender and always engaging. Yeah, I read a lot as well. Oh, this is, okay, Mr. Whippy, yes. That's breathing in and breathing out, actually. It gets worse, folks. This was a long time ago. Yeah. So how do we learn to love the physicality, the fleshiness of our bodies? Okay, and then I spent a lot of time in reading theoretical texts. I know that I should give you time to read that quote. It's pretty grim. Yes, okay. Yes, carefully chosen theoretical texts, exemplars of defining or defiant, were projected upon our fragmented aging bodies to challenge the inscription of medical, psychoanalytic and cultural discourses upon the body. Freud and Irigaray here. Only legible when the text touches the skin. The authority of such normative and clinical prescriptions was undermined by the exuberance and presence of the vitality of our living, breathing, older women's bodies. Flesh overpowers the word as the body answers back. And here probably a quote from one of the women who may well have been on your Women's Land series, in which she's saying, the evil eye that's projected on older women may only be the eye from which the scales have fallen. A challenge to the previous Now, I'll change the atmosphere. In my recent work, I've examined the deep, dark, and difficult emotions linked to bereavement, grief, and loss. It's been the focus. And this is collaborative work with Seija Ulkimeni on mourning, made in Finland. Seija's beloved daughter Milka had recently died of cancer at the age of 26. We went to Seija's summer cottage, way above the Arctic Circle. There Seija gathered blueberries, a very Finnish summer cottage pleasure, something Milka loved to do. The berries squashed like blood on her hands. Seija covered her hands with ashes from the fire and then drew them down her face in a moment of grief and release. Washed the ashes from her face and used the scarf that Milka had worn during the last years of her life, to cover the chemo-scarred head. Letting the scarf go, it floated like a rose and slowly sank. And I was still working on my mum, death of my mum. This was a very intense time we spent looking at, talking about, dealing with grief, being with grief. And I suppose what I'm trying to emphasize is the quality of the way we worked, really more than even than the images, because it is about a deep connection. I had copied the photograph of my mother taken in 1939 when World War II was declared. I projected this image onto the exact same corner in my parents' house where it had been taken all those years before. I printed this image on silk, a shimmering and uncertain surface as a metaphor for memory, and I took that silk with me to Finland. And so in this, I'm looking through her image in a way to find myself. Whereas here I'm tenderly embracing this image of my mother. I then wrapped myself in her image. And we've been talking about the haptic today. Yes, I got into immerse myself in the lake, immerse myself in the emotion of the loss. And the attempt was to somehow contain the idea of the good enough mother so that she could continue to support me emotionally. And I know the series with Seija are indeed elegiac, but just to shift the mood. I've also been collaborating with Verity Worsted recently. And this is something slightly naughtier. 2 minutes, oh blimey. I didn't put myself down for sainthood, okay? I'll have to hurry. I said to one of Mum's visiting carers that it felt like sainthood being a carer. For any of you who've done this work, it is. You have to deny yourself. Somebody else's needs always come first. And you kind of don't exist when you're in the carer's role because you're just there for. It's tough. So, in a way, this is very tongue-in-cheek because obviously I wasn't a saint, but it felt like as if I was expected to be. But the reality was that I felt vampired, actually. My energies were eaten. So this is it's beautiful and very angry work in a way. This is more recent work I've done with Verity, going back to questions of aging. We found lots of beige and taupe clothes and managed to make ourselves look really awful, but somehow this was the one that we kind of liked, and we're wearing my mother's woolen vest actually, but something about, there's 20 years difference between us, but we're actually saying, yes, these are real women's bodies. Get used to it. Really get used to it. And I'll end with a video called Letting Go, and I hope the sound's off. Yeah. Play? Yes, slowly.